Welcome into episode 35 of the 5 Reasons Podcast. I'm Ethan Skolnick here, as always, with Chris Winningham. You can find us on Twitter at 5 Reasons Sports. You can download us on iTunes if you have Apple, but also on Google Play if you have Android. We also have a YouTube feed now, so be sure to check that out. You can get that through our Twitter feed, and make sure you go through our library so you subscribe and get all of our episodes for free. One of the things we've been doing on the podcast lately has been bringing guests in, bringing in experts. There is nobody more expert on the Miami Heat than Ira Winderman. I used to work with him. I used to work against him. We've been all kinds of different roles here. You can hear him not only on 560 QAM from time to time, but also, obviously, you can read him on sunsentinel.com. Ira, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be the resident expert of the moment until Tom D'Angelo or someone else comes along, but I'm glad to be here, guys.
All right, what we're going to do here, what we do on the pod, Ira, is we try to break things into sort of, and again, you guys do some of this stuff with your newspapers now. We try to break them into sort of bite-sized morsels, right?
Sure.
Like allow people to digest the information. And so what we do here is we break things into 5 parts. And what we thought about, because we don't really know for sure as we tape this on a Sunday night, where the Heat are going to fall. It's going to be 6 or it's going to be 7. If the Heat win their next game, Milwaukee loses their next game, then the Heat would end up in the 6th spot. But we don't know who's going to end up on the other side of that, because we don't know whether or not Philadelphia is going to hold on to 3. So we didn't want to make this too team specific. We wanted to take a look at the Heat players. And I put a poll on at 5 Reasons Sports and said, who do you think is the most important player to the Heat in the upcoming playoffs? And the results were a little surprising to me, actually. I put 4 players on there. We're going to debate all 4 of these guys. I put, in no particular order, I put Wade, Whiteside, Dragic, and Richardson. And not surprisingly, because this team does not have one superstar, it was pretty split. But the order that it came in was Dragic first, Wade second, Whiteside a close third, and then Richardson at about 19 or 20%. Was 4th. So all 4 guys had a certain constituency, but Dragic ended up in the lead. And so we're going to start with him for part 1. And there was a lot of talk a couple of years ago about how Goran had not really played in a lot of playoff games, right? Like he had the incredible moment against San Antonio a few years back when he was a Sun, but had not played in the playoffs a lot. We saw him in the playoffs 2 years ago and didn't play particularly well against Charlotte, and then he picked it up. He had a couple of games in the Toronto series. What does Goran Dragic, in your view, Ira, need to do in the postseason for this team to have a chance to advance?
He needs to be the streak scorer. He needs to be the guy that when the Heat when we know, look, Ethan, in the playoffs, other teams, the way they scout, the way they break you down, they're going to take away your number 1, number 2, number 3 top play calls. They know what you're doing. So you have to be that guy. Eric Spoelstra always uses this word, and I know we'll get into a lot of Spoisms here, ignitable. Who's going to be the ignitable Heat player? Guys, I almost think Goran Dragic is the only one who can be. I mean, I'm being deferential to Dwyane. He's coming off the bench a little more. But if you were to tell me, Ira, who's the guy most likely to score 10, 12, 14 straight Miami Heat points in this series, I would tell you almost that they're at a point right now, I don't think it could be anyone else right now but Goran Dragic, because I don't think they have another player who I can look at and say, well, absolutely he's going to score this many points, or he's going to be that kind of player. So I think if you're talking about who's going to be, quote-unquote, ignitable for the Heat, I think he's your only option.
For me, the thing that is most interesting about Dragic is that the Miami Heat are going into a playoffs where if they face Cleveland, if they face Philly, which seems to be the most likely matchup at this point, what you saw on Friday night from both of those teams is an amount of offensive firepower that I'm not sure that the Miami Heat can keep up with. So to me, where Goran Dragic comes in that equation is getting Miami easy baskets, because he, for me, is the only one that really likes to take the ball off a rebound and get in transition, try and score quickly. And I feel like the Miami Heat, because they're going against these teams like Philly, like Cleveland, that are just have no problem at the moment dropping 120, while that probably won't keep up in the playoffs, and I think the Heat strategy will be in some respect to try and slow the game down a bit and prevent games from getting away from them, I do think they have to figure out ways to manufacture easier points, and there are 2 players that can do that. Whiteside with offensive rebounding and Goran Dragic in transition playing at pace. So I think that's Goran Dragic's role to play in the series.
And you know what, Chris, I would agree with that. And again, the rebounding, whether it's Hassan Whiteside getting the offensive rebounds, but even if Goran is going to get out and go, you have to get those defensive rebounds. So the rebounding, whether it's James Johnson, undersized power forward, Hassan Whiteside, we'll get to him a little bit later, a little bit lethargic at this point, that's going to make defensive rebounding critical. Not that it always isn't anyway, but to get Goran out on those one-man breaks, he is the one guy in this team where if he's going 1-on-2 or 1-on-3, you don't say, oh, no. You basically say, oh, go, because he creates a way. No one drops the shoulder like Goran Dragic to create spacing. No one shoves his man out of the way so subtly, usually with the trail referee behind, so we can't even see. So I agree with that. Goran has to be great. And Ethan mentioned the Toronto series. And Ethan, I know you can talk to this also. Goran was so deferential when Dwyane Wade was first here. It was just a case that he was going to make Dwyane the guy, and he was going to step out of the way. That's why when people ask me, might Dwyane Wade start in the playoffs? No way. Because, Ethan, you can address this. By Dwyane simply being there 2 years ago, Goran didn't want to be the man because he felt it wasn't his place to be the man.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, that is, look, Goran's personality, and we've had this conversation on the pod before, but when I ran into Goran at Family Fest and he told me, you know, he didn't really want to do another All-Star game because it was too crowded. That sort of speaks to Goran's personality. He's just not the kind of person who needs the spotlight, wants the spotlight. And again, you look at his relationship with Dwyane, he has been deferential to Dwyane from the very start. I mean, since Goran was traded to Miami. And so I agree with you, and we're going to get into Dwyane in more depth, but I would think that Eric's going to leave Dwyane on the bench and again, try to separate them as much as possible, at least until the last 5 or 6 minutes of games. Going back to that Toronto series, here's the other difference on this one. In that playoffs 2 years ago, the 2 point guards that Goran faced were Kemba Walker and Kyle Lowry. And you remember the way that Kemba worked him for certain periods of that series against Charlotte. The one positive of facing Cleveland or Philadelphia is they don't have that type of point guard. I mean, because Ben Simmons is playing point for Philadelphia, but obviously Goran's not going to be guarding him. So you're talking about a little bit of an easier matchup for Goran, whether it's George Hill, you know, who's a good player, but not the kind of guy who's going to go off on a scoring spree against you. And then, you know, a TJ McConnell or, you know, potentially Markelle Fultz. I mean, we'll see how much he plays for Philadelphia. But it's a more manageable matchup for Goran on the defensive end, which I think will save him a little bit to be more of a scorer. And you look at his playoff numbers from 2 years ago, they weren't bad. I mean, he averaged 16.5 points. He shot 44% from the field, 35% from three. So, but there were just a lot of ups and downs in there. But I'm with you, Ira. He needs to be aggressive. I mean, they can't go back into the same thing where it's just rely on Dwyane to save us because, again, every year that they do that, Dwayne's a little bit older and is just too much of a burden to put on him. I guess the question, Ira, on this going forward on it, do you think that they'll be able to get into a pace game with Philadelphia or Cleveland? Will they want to get in a pace game? Because I know that's where Goran's at their best.
That's two different questions. Can they get into a pace game? Anyone can get into a pace game because a pace game could be running up and down and taking bad shots and missing bad shots. Do they want to get into a pace game? I don't think so, Ethan. I think that, you know, people confuse sometimes Goran's one-man fast break with playing fast. And Goran is smart enough when he has to pull the ball out. But except for him in transition, there is no other pace game. James Johnson likes to play in the open court, but he's not going to push the ball that well. We saw it didn't end well in that one loss up in Cleveland when he had the last shot there. So I think what it's going to see is Goran's going to push the ball. If it's there, he'll attack. If not, he'll bring it out. But there's only one way for the Heat to beat the Cavaliers. There's only one way for the Heat to beat the Sixers, and maybe to beat anyone, and that's that low-scoring slog of a game that's so untelegenic, except that's how they win their games. That's how they played Houston, for example, this season. That's how they played Golden State for half a game and 3/4 of a game. So if you're saying, are the Heat going to play in the playoff games in the 120s or 110s? Well, they might play them there, but they're not going to win them there.
I don't understand that, though, Ira, because you look at the sort of guard and wing-heavy team that they have. I just think that with James Johnson and Justice Winslow, if either one of them is playing small ball 4, you could go up and down the floor. Richardson and Tyler Johnson and Dragic and even Roddy McGruder when he plays. I understand Wade and Whiteside aren't really built for pace games, and you could probably argue that Olynyk's not either, but are you surprised that the Heat don't play a bit more with pace? Because I feel like that's something that their roster could be tailor-made to do.
Yeah, but I think you look, Chris, at the rotations and the other team, and you say, your guys could do that. Are they going to do it better than Larry Nance Jr.? Are they going to do it better than Jordan Clarkson? Are they going to do it better than the other guys? Each of this matchup will have its own metronome, its own pace, based on the opposition, and that's where Eric will sort of draw the line. Is he doing like Pat Riley, remember that great quote Pat Riley used to have, I'm going to slow this thing to a crawl if I have to. The Heat's never going back to that. We know that. The game has evolved too much. You are not going to win playoff games 79, 76 anymore. And if you think you are, you're going to see that on the scoreboard at the end of the third quarter. But I think, Chris, it's a case of each individual matchup. And most of these matchups that I'm looking now of all the Heat possibilities, I just think the other team has guys who do that better than the Heat. And Ethan referenced it. You put Markelle Fultz and his speed in there. That's another detriment when you're going against Philly. Now, if Philly's going to have Bellinelli and Ilyasova and some of their bigs out there, yes, in those moments you can. But I'm not so sure for 30, 40, 48 minutes you can.
All right, let's get to our second guy. And first thing, before we go on, do any of you guys, because I don't, do either of you guys identify Goran as the most important player for the Heat in the playoffs? I have a reason for the guy that I'm picking, but it's not going to be Dragic.
Well, it's interesting because in my Sun Sentinel column at sunsentinel.com, I rated the Heat's most valuable player, and to me it was a runaway for Goran based on his season's body of work. But even like Chris mentioned, Goran is not the most unique player in most series. He's a very nice player. He's a contributing player. But usually you win series and you win games because you have something uniquely different than the other team. I think we'd all agree Goran is not so uniquely different that of his skill sets, he's the definitive best or most unusual in the league. So I think from what Goran we'd all agree you're expecting and have to have is consistency. But I don't know if he's ever going to be the ultimate difference maker in a game or especially in a series.
I agree 100%. I think the player I'll be picking is someone who is more along those lines.
Yeah, me too. So we'll get to him in a second. I don't want to give it away quite yet. I don't know if it's this particular player, but we're going to move on to number 2, and it was second in the poll, which was Dwyane Wade. And there's a couple reasons I think that people would pick Dwyane. I mean, one is obviously he's the guy that people are counting on to deliver in clutch situations. So if you define someone who is most important, someone might look at it and say, well, who's going to be taking the shots at the end of the game? And it's likely going to be Dwyane in most situations. So I think that's part of it. And then the second part is just pedigree, just generally that if Dwyane is Dwyane, that, he's your most important player. Now, I'm not picking him because I'm picking someone else, and I got a feeling that you guys might pick the same guy.
Sure.
But I want to get to some of the specifics with Dwyane since he's been here. We did an entire pod on this with Manny a few weeks ago, Ira, where we're kind of looking at the effect that Dwyane's had on other players. Now, as we come into this, we're talking right now, he's played 19 games for the Heat. He's had some moments. Clearly, the Philadelphia game, the entire thing was a moment that he had the 27 points in the last second shot. But if you look at his net rating right now, he's a -2 with the Heat so far, a 101.8 offensive rating, 103.8 defensive rating. So the Heat it's been this interesting phenomenon, Ira, because the Heat's been much better offensively since he's arrived. Like, the numbers bear that out pretty clearly. But they haven't necessarily been that much better offensively with him on the court. How do you sort of evaluate how he's affected other guys on the team so far?
This is what I would do if I was Eric Spoelstra. I would put a split screen up on a video board when they're getting ready for their series. And I'd have Dwyane Wade on one side. And I'd put a slide of Rodney McGruder on the other and tell his players this. For Dwyane Wade's first 20 minutes every game, I want you to think that guy is that guy. And stop deferring to Dwyane Wade except at the end. Because until the end of games, Dwyane is not the player right now where he's that dominant force that he has to be the number one option every possession that he's in the game. That's where the Heat are bogging down when they're looking at him at that. Then I would go to a full screen. And Eric and I tell the players, but in the final 2 minutes, this guy is not Rodney McGruder. This guy is going to the Hall of Fame. That's when you defer. I think what's happened to the Heat is that pullback from everything they run, from their continuity, from their dribble handoff stops when Dwyane, honestly, guys, walks to the scorer's table. That's been a detriment to this team. They have to tell this guy, this is your closer, but this can't be your carrier the entire game. I think if they get to that point, they'll be better off. I think if they can get Dwyane more to lineups where he has someone who can help him defensively, he has those great lobs to Hassan, but a lot of times he's playing with Kelly Olynyk. Because you know what? I know this sounds unfair almost, but you're going to have to hide Dwyane defensively also in the playoffs, because don't kid yourself. With all the respect that every coach that he played, whether it's Brett Brown, whether it's Tyronn Lue, whether it's someone else, they're going to talk up Dwyane. And in their strategy meetings, they're going to also say, and when he's on the court, go against him, because this guy is also 36 years old.
But to me, the thing about Dwyane Wade, and I kind of learned this lesson in 2016 when I was kind of having a go at the Heat for relying on him so much, is that I do think that Dwyane Wade, and he's talked about it from a sort of different perspective, which is the idea of playing for moments at this point, playing for that game like against Philadelphia when he gets the winning shot and 27 points in the game. But I do think that Dwyane Wade, and I went to a ton of games from kind of 2013 to 2016, and you can tell even kind of early in that descent that he was kind of taking plays and quarters off. He was being very economical about his movement, particularly on defense. And I do think that once the playoffs start, he does have the ability and the desire to ratchet up his effort and his exertion in a game. And if you're telling him that he's got to play 22 minutes, 24 minutes, and then close the game for us, I do think he is capable of being a quality player on both ends. And while, yes, I looked at the numbers, Ira, and the Heat aren't just bad, but they're pretty bad on offense with Dwyane Wade in first halves, and then that improves a lot in the fourth quarter. But I do think that he has the ability to ramp it up now in the postseason, and I do think if we're talking about second and third gears, he's certainly someone that has that way more than anyone else on the Heat. And it's actually why I'm going to surprise you both and say he is my most important player in the series, is because if he's going to be the one with the ball in his hands at the end of the game, and if he's the one that's, whether we like it or not, going to be the player that other players on the Heat defer to, then he has the biggest role to play in the series, in any series.
Yeah, but Chris, he has to carry them to that moment. In other words, to get to a moment of truth, you have to play the game so you can create a moment of truth. Obviously, we know that he does nothing but play clutch games during the regular season, a little different in the playoffs when teams will look to stop at you. You have to get to that point. But here's the issue I have with you, Chris, as I put on your Mr. Analytics hat. What's the worst shot in basketball? It's that mid-range jumper. What is Dwyane Wade's bread and butter mostly? His mid-range jumper. Every time Dwyane shoots a mid-range or a long two, it's not a three for Wayne Ellington. It's not a three for Goran. Yeah, exactly. It's not a three for Goran. It's not a three for even Tyler Johnson. And Dwyane's attack moments, and you could look this up, he's not the attack dunk guy. I mean, he has a few, but it's not the same. So do you want to rely, like you pointed out, on those 22 minutes a game of 18 minutes of looking for mid-range jumpers? Because, again, the Sixers, with Ilyasova, with Bellinelli, with Covington, with Saric, they have three-point shooters. We know the Cavs, I mean, for their playoff runs the last 3 years, have been unbelievably three-point centric. So I'm just worried, if you turn the offense to Dwyane Wade, are you making the cardinal sin of basketball of trading twos for threes?
The interesting question to me with Dwyane, too, is also, like you said, who he'll guard. Because we've seen some of these moments where, he's had, the shot blocks and the things that, remind you how good he is at that. But I'm looking at the two teams, and there's some matchups that would be favorable for him. For instance, if Cleveland goes with its current lineup, which right now they're playing, Hood and Hill in the backcourt. I know they just moved Jeff Green into the starting lineup, and they're going to make a decision between Nance and Thompson around LeBron as their backup at the 5 spot. But, for right now, it looks like, you might get Dwyane matched up with, say, coming off the bench with, say, a Korver or a J.R. Smith. I mean, those are both matchups that he can handle, right, even at this stage. I mean, Korver's going to run him off a bunch of screens, but at least you're not talking about the fleetest of foot there, and J.R. Smith is a shell of the player that he used to be. Philadelphia is interesting because, like you said, I don't know what they're going to do with Fultz. And we don't know how many minutes he's going to play, but that changes the equation somewhat. If they're going to play Fultz with McConnell, if they're go smaller, I think, like, for instance, I think Dwyane can guard Redick. It's the same situation as Korver because, again, a bunch of screens. But, with Fultz, I mean, that's, just in terms of a speed advantage, that would be a challenge for Dwyane. But the other question I have, too, Ira, is, we talk about him not starting, and I agree with you. I think Eric's going to keep him on the bench. Mm-hmm. But does he up the minutes? Because in the playoffs, I mean, even though the season was more spread out this season than past seasons, in the playoffs it's really spread out. And how Eric feels about Dwyane. I mean, Eric has rerun that quote this year that he gave me 3 years ago about I'll go to my grave with Dwyane taking the shot at the end of the game. Is Eric going to start pushing Dwyane's minutes to 30, 31, 32, 33 just because, again, he's not Rodney Magruder, he's Dwyane Wade?
Again, I'd almost answer it this way by answering with a player who, even if you did a 10 Things podcast, we probably wouldn't get into here, and that's this. What the heck has happened to Tyler Johnson? What the heck has happened to his growth curve where you felt so comfortable, especially when he was in reserve last year with James Johnson? Remember last year, Tyler Johnson always finished games. I think for most of the season, he led the NBA in fourth quarter minutes. Now it's almost like you can send him home after the third quarter. So I think there's always multiple parts to these rotation equations. And to me, with Dwyane Wade, how many minutes Dwyane Wade gets could be in direct correlation to Tyler Johnson. Tyler comes out every game, hits 2 3-pointers early in the game, and that's often the last you see of him. So I think Dwyane's minutes will totally come down to Tyler Johnson and whether there's any sort of revival there. Because if there's not, how long can you ride Tyler Johnson? That's one guy that's really surprised me this year. You know he's going into that $19 million season next year. You want to feel more comfortable. And instead, if you're asking me to even line up the Heat's guards in a 5 Reasons podcast, I might have him in 5th place.
I do want to actually emphasize your point, Ira, because I mentioned that I die a little inside on Dwyane Wade's mid-range jumpers. Well,
Sure.
I just looked at the numbers on NBA.com/stats, and it's actually more inefficient than even your average NBA mid-range jumper. Since joining the Heat and over the course of this 2017-18 season, so with the Heat, he's 33.3% on shots greater than 10 feet. If you factor out the three-point percentage, the number gets a little bit better. I'm not saying a lot of bit better, but he's 9 for 38 on threes since coming to Miami. On overall jumpers greater than 10 feet, he's 33% on mid-range, so in between 10 and the three-point arc, it's 37.3%. That's just flatly inefficient, and if that's just going to be the bulk of the offense when he's in the game, the Heat are going to lose, but the problem is that every time I've done this and every time I've gotten yelled at for criticizing Dwyane Wade and his shot selection, he sticks it right in my face in the final minute of a game. So that's just how it's going to be.
We're not arguing that. I agree with everyone here. At the end of the game, I am as comfortable with Dwyane getting the ball as anyone. I have no issue with that. Well, we can get into that after, but what I'm saying is until that point, I think the Heat have higher percentage options, better match a 3-for-3 options, or better point-blank options that we'll get to next when you talk about that also. So for me, there's 2 Dwyane Wade elements. There's Dwyane Wade's minutes 1 through 46 and Dwyane Wade minutes 47, 48, or knowing the Heat this year going up to 53. I still feel comfortable in those moments because you know what? Manufacture a good look, where sometimes we've seen with Josh Richardson and James Johnson and other guys at the end of games, they couldn't even manufacture a look, let alone get the basket.
So let me ask you, Ira, before we move on to our third
Sure.
guy. Now, Chris has identified Dwyane as his most important player. We both agree it's not Dragic. Without giving away who it is it Dwyane for you?
It is not Dwyane for me because I believe there's more than just 2 minutes of a game. And if it is Dwyane for me, then that really says something about the 2018 Miami Heat.
Okay, we'll be right back with Ira Winderman. But for now, a quick break.
This week on the Balls Cast, we debate whether or not Heat culture matters.
They talk about certain players don't want to come here because of it.
Yeah, those guys.
Right, but those guys are good.
Miami Dolphins CEO Tom Garfinkel talks new uniforms.
You know, the tweaks are, I think, make us look more like the Miami Dolphins of old.
And then we make them speak in a German accent.
Excuse me, I need a bottle of your finest champagne bought since the Garfinkel Spoon immediately.
Plus, we share our stories about our worst dates ever.
She probably used the N-word like 7 times.
This week on the Balls Cast.
All right, so let's get to number 3 here, and I'm going to give this away right at the start. To me, this is the most important player for the Heat in the playoffs because we talk about a guy who can make them different, who can take over a game if he is so inclined. And that is always the caveat that needs to be added here. And that was the third choice by people in our poll, which was Hassan Whiteside. And this is the conversation we had here. Ira, Chris and I know you've talked about this quite a bit on radio. Chris and I sort of bounced this around for 45 minutes the other day, so I won't bore you with all of it. But basically what the thing with Hassan is, some people will look at that and say, that's crazy, a guy who hasn't played in the majority of fourth quarters this year, to say he's the most important guy in a potential series. But I look at both of these series and moving forward against Cleveland, okay, no, they don't have a traditional 5 if they're going to be starting Kevin Love there. But clearly, if they're going to be starting Kevin Love there, Hassan's going to need to get out on the perimeter and guard Kevin Love. And that's something that they're going to need to deal with. And on the other side, provided that he gets back healthy, and I would assume he's going to before the playoffs start, Hassan has to be as motivated for Joel Embiid as he was in the regular season matchup that he dominated, or else the Heat are going to get throttled in that series. So to me, it's Hassan because Hassan makes them different, and beyond that, the thing that you need to be able to at least compete with LeBron in a series, if it ends up being Cleveland, you need multiple perimeter defenders who are not afraid of him. Doesn't mean they're going to stop him, but will at least challenge him. I do believe the Heat have a couple of those guys. And then you need a rim deterrent like we saw back in the day with Roy Hibbert, and Hassan, if he's engaged, can provide that. So I'll ask you before we start, is Hassan your guy?
I'm going to go off script from all our pre-pro notes and say no, and my guy's going to come in at level 5 here, and our fifth reason, and I'll tell you why then. And this is why I'm sort of changing my thoughts on Hassan. It's exactly what you just said, Ethan. The Cavaliers matchup, if Cleveland does stay with Kevin Love at center, I think that's unwinnable for this reason, and I've written about this in my columns at sunsentinel.com. The way you win a matchup like that is you are so dominant, so physical, so explosive, so fierce that the other team has to say uncle and has to bring in Tristan Thompson and has to play bigger against you if it's the Cavaliers. And my thing with Hassan this year is, and I'm almost using the recency factor here also, I don't know, Ethan, what's going on with him. I don't know if it's the bone bruise on the knee that's still there or some injury. I don't know if it's mental or psychological or something that he's having its differences with Erik Spoelstra. But going back even to the Knicks game we saw in New York on Friday, he's not explosive. I refer to this, he's throwing up his flippy-dippy-do kind of shots. He's not ramming the ball to the basket. So when I look at equations like that, or even any team going small against the Heat, perhaps they wind up with the Celtics and it's an Al Horford matchup or something like that, or Toronto goes smaller and you have to guard Ibaka on the perimeter, Hassan's not making the other team pay. I don't know why. And to me, that's the most confounding part of the end of the season. Why isn't Hassan Whiteside dunking more? Why isn't Hassan Whiteside flexing more? Why isn't Hassan Whiteside explosive more? I'll defer to Mr. Whittingham and all his beautiful statistics and stuff there. But that's the point, Ethan, that I just don't understand anymore. What has happened to muscle flexing Hassan Whiteside? Because if he's going to shoot those dippy, slippy do shots, or whatever you want to call them, Kevin Love can guard that. Anyone can guard that. He's not shoving you out of the way, ripping off your manhood, and making you limp back the other way down the court. That, to me, is the element that's missing.
Yeah, and to me, the most interesting bit of his season is the way that his minutes have changed. His minutes have gone down, we can now say, at the conclusion of the year, about 7 per game, and obviously that's where the controversy comes from, was the sort of decrease in minutes in the end of games and in the fourth quarter. And we've seen about half his fourth quarters this year where he hasn't played, and it is kind of shocking that, you're right, Ira, his game has changed, but you still look at his numbers at the end of all of it, on a permanent basis, they're about the same as they used to be. So I do kind of wonder where he is at this point, and I don't think you can discount what happened with the public comments. And I know the next game he went out and he played at the end and he got an important offensive rebound, which for me would be his role to play. But I still think that Erik Spoelstra in a series against Cleveland, maybe he stays out there in a series against Embiid, but he's got to guard him to the three-point line. I just think the idea that Hassan Whiteside's game can be picked on is something that I think the Heat have to worry about, not just with him, but on a bigger level. Because I think what you've seen in playoff basketball the last few years is teams with exaggerated game plans. And I always go back to Steve Kerr against Tony Allen, leaving him wide open in the corner and throwing Andrew Bogut on him. I just see teams with the ability to scout, with the ability to figure out the ways to deploy those kinds of tactics in a 7-game series, not necessarily leaving Whiteside alone, but trying to put somebody small on him or have him guard further out away from the rim. It's going to be difficult for him to figure out how to play in a series like this when the opposing coach will be looking for ways to expose him.
And I'm going to ask you guys a question that might force you to pause the podcast and your listeners to pull over on the side of the road and give this deep consideration. But I'm going to ask this to both of you guys. And this, to me, is among the most telling things about the Hassan Whiteside experience. Guys, when's the last time you saw a team double-team Hassan? Bring the double, feel they had to have the double, compelled were to bring the double? Think about that for a second. Wasn't it Hassan Whiteside when he was this compelling figure when he first arrived and was putting up triple-doubles against the Celtics and the Bulls that teams were always running a second man at him? Could you guys, literally, if you want to pause here and go through video or something, when's the last time you saw someone routinely feel that they absolutely, in their matchup, had to bring a double team at Hassan Whiteside?
And you would think that they would want to because, again, you would want to test him as a passer, and nobody does it. And his assist numbers have gone up a little bit this year, but you're right. I mean, I haven't – look, it's just an interesting argument here because, like Chris mentions, the per 36 numbers are the same. I mean, they're even a little better than they've been. And yet this is an eye test thing, really. This is not a stats thing. It's an eye test thing. And it's just like you said, he's not making a consistent impact the way that he was – a couple of years ago, where again you come out of a game and you're like, Hassan dramatically changed that game, and because he still has it in him because we did see it in that game against Philadelphia and against Embiid, and clearly gets so motivated for that, and that's one of the reasons why again I picked him, because if they get Philadelphia, the advantage that Philly has over a lot of teams, if Whiteside is motivated for whatever reason, it could be personal pride or it could just be because he doesn't like Embiid. It doesn't matter what the reason is. If he gets motivated for that series and can play Embiid to even a draw, then the Heat have a chance in that series. Now, I love some of what you mentioned, some of the names Philadelphia's added. I love what Philadelphia's done with its depth. Yes. I mean, adding Ilyasova and Bellinelli was huge for them, and those are two guys that are going to play 20-plus minutes in the playoffs. But I think you have a chance against Philly if Whiteside plays him even. But you're right, the other dynamic that Embiid has is the ability to stretch out to the three-point line, and so if that becomes a problem, then you could see perhaps Bam playing a little more or somebody who's a little bit more mobile in that sense. But look, maybe I'm a little old school on this because, maybe I'm thinking like Pat thinks on this, which is why Pat gave him $98 million. But I still think that in a playoff series can have a big impact. And I still go back to that Toronto series 2 years ago, Ira, where I know Valanciunas went down too, but if Hassan had been healthy in that series, I still think they win that series against the Raptors. He wasn't, and they lost in 7 games. So I'm looking at it that way. And I also, look at the fact that, Whiteside has played, if you look at his numbers, reasonably well against Cleveland in the past. So I'm still holding out hope that he's going to have the kind of series that sort of justifies the contract and justifies the faith they put in him. But you're right, we haven't seen those kind of explosive moments. All right, let's move on to number 4 here. The fourth guy on our list, because he was picked fourth when it put up there in the poll. About 20% of people thought Josh Richardson was the most important player for the Heat in the playoffs. He's been identified by people outside of Miami, too, as their best two-way player. But I wanted to go through some of the numbers here and see, Ira, if you can explain this, because clearly something has happened here. If you start the season in October, he averaged 11.7 points a game. November, he was at 7.6. But then December, he has this breakout. He plays 15 games in December. He shoots 55% from the field, 47% from three, 89% from the line, while averaging 4 rebounds a game, and he averages 17.4 points a game. Like, he had an incredible December, and all the metrics bear it out. All the plus-minus numbers, the offensive rating, the defensive rating, all of it was terrific. And then you look from December on, Ira, and it just starts to trail off. I mean, January was still relatively strong. He averaged 14 points, 42% from three, 42% overall. February averaged 14.9, 48%, 46 from three. But then March and April, 12.5 points in March, 10 points in April. He's shooting a little over 43% over that period of time. He's still at about 40% from three over that period of time. Is it as simple as Dwyane showed up and Josh Richardson took a back seat, or is there something else going on there?
You know what? One thing, and I know this sounds so simplistic, but this really is the factor in the playoffs. You get scouted more when you become a somebody. So I think there was a degree of them looking at what Josh Richardson does, where he wants the ball. I know it almost sounds cliche, guys, that he showed up, quote unquote, on the scouting report, but I think there's a degree of that also in the way he's going to go. So when I look at Josh, I say to myself, I've always felt that his scoring was a bonus. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't appreciated when it showed up on cue and when it showed up when it was needed more. But to me, and I'll get to this in the 5th segment also, to me, you're going to have one designated, he's my defensive guy. We know Spoelstra all year, and he, as you guys both know, being around the Heat, they don't campaign for postseason awards. They don't send me all kinds of trinkets and really good T-shirts and stuff like that. They just say the guy's going to do it on their own merit. But Erik Spoelstra has spoken all year about how, hey, Josh Richardson, he deserves votes for all defensive team, for one of the all defensive teams, if not first team. So I get all of that also. So to me, as much as Josh Richardson's offense has been coming down, has been sort of going the other direction, maybe that's sort of a compliment to him. But this is my question, and I'll get to this more in the 5th segment. Who's going to be the Heat guy when you need a stop one-on-one, when the other team, which is always going to happen in playoffs, goes ISO? Is it Josh Richardson? Is it Justice Winslow? Is it James Johnson? Is Josh Richardson, as much as Eric Spoelstra says it, is he really that guy? Is he the guy that when I see DeMar DeRozan or Kyle Lowry, maybe even LeBron James or Boston, who are you, Jaylen Brown right now, or maybe Jason Tatum or someone like that, who has the ball, who I'm going to feel confident, okay, Jay Rich is isolated, but I feel good about this matchup. To me, that's what he has to be. If we're going to debate who's the key player for the Heat, do you believe that Josh Richardson will be the primary and critical perimeter defender? To me, that's the real Josh Richardson question, even more than his offense.
Yeah, I think Richardson was probably hurt the most by Dwyane Wade's introduction, but I just think that, and we saw it in his rookie year as well, that I don't think he really is a player who at this point is going to put together 6 months like he had at December. I think he's not he's not that level of player, and I think what he is a really nice player and someone who I think we're talking about a team that is, I would say, have two of the worst contracts in the league in Whiteside and in Tyler Johnson, and don't have a ton of value. I would say Josh Richardson could probably represent value based off the extension you signed him to, but I just don't think he's that quality of player. He can do it at times, he can do it for months, but for a 6-month season, for a big playoff series, I don't know if game in and game out you're getting a top-level performance unless you're building a team around him, and I don't think if you're building a team around him, that team is very good.
And Chris, that's why I wrote in my Sun Sentinel column a couple of weeks ago, in my Sunday column, this exact point. That's the beauty of these playoffs. Are the Heat winning a championship? No offense, guys, but if we're still doing a podcast here in late May and June, I'll be more surprised than anyone. But if you can find out in the heat of the playoffs, is someone good enough? Is he able to step up to the moment? That's what we're going to see about some of the guys we'll talk about in the next segment, but more than anything, we'll see about Josh Richardson. Because if he's not, and that'll be a shame because you won as many playoff games as you can, then you might go into next season and go, you know what? This was an interesting ride. He was our starter now for as many as 81 games this season, but he's not a starting small forward on a championship contending team. That's the beauty of this upcoming playoff series and maybe beyond. You will really get to take measure of players in playoff situations. And the Heat, I think, you know what, if you were to ask in this podcast, who's the most important player to get a read on in a playoff series, I think Josh Richardson might be that guy.
It's interesting you mentioned that, too, in this sense. We didn't really get a feel for Josh 2 years ago in the playoffs because he wasn't healthy. He'd hurt his shoulder. He was never really quite right during that playoff run, and he was coming off that second half of the season. As Chris said, he can have periods of time. The second half of his rookie season, he led the league in three-point shooting. And he came into the playoffs and didn't shoot the ball well in the playoffs, and part of that might have been the shoulder, and part of it might have been, as you're talking about, Ira, that he was scouted a little bit. But one thing that is interesting in their wins and losses this year, if you look at their splits, he is a bit of a tell. He shoots 43% from three in their wins. He shoots 33% from three in their losses. Now, I'm sure there are probably some other players on the team that might have a similar type split because obviously three-point shooting is critical to winning. But that is a pretty big disparity. When Josh is making his three-point shot, they tend to win. When he's not, they don't. So I think the other thing to look at here, you mentioned who he'll guard, and clearly, I mean, he's somebody in the starting lineup that you're going to want to put on the best wing in most situations. But you look at the two matchups, he's probably the guy, and maybe you'll make a case for someone else when we get to number 5 here, but he's probably the guy who's going to see a lot of time on Ben Simmons. And even with Josh's length, there's a length issue there because there's a length issue against Ben Simmons on all cases.
Sure.
And then he's also going to get some turns against LeBron, although I don't think he would get the primary turn against LeBron, which, again, is something we're going to talk about. All right, so let's get to number 5 here. We're going to do these ones a little bit quicker, but what we did was before the pod, all three of us decided to sort of take someone here, or in my case, it'll be a combination of someone's that we would say, could be the X factor here. And for Ira, this person is actually going to be his choice because he hasn't chosen any of the other 4. So I will start with mine, and then we'll get to your guys here after that. I'm going to go with the combination of Olynyk and Ellington for this reason. They are going to need to create as much space as they possibly can, particularly if Dwyane is going to be playing heavy minutes or heavier minutes than he does during the regular season. And so I do think there are going to be some situations where Eric goes to essentially 4 guards. I mean, if you want to call Josh Richardson a guard, where you have Dragic out there with Wade and Ellington as well as Richardson, and they try to really space the floor against some of these teams. And again, especially if Philadelphia goes a little bit smaller by, say, putting Bellinelli at the 3. And then we talk about Whiteside. I talk about how important he is, but Kelly Olynyk has been their best big in fourth quarters this year, and he's already shown that he can do it in the playoffs because he carried Boston in that Game 7 to get to the Eastern Conference Finals last year. So clearly he's comfortable in those moments. I know, we talk about Whiteside, we talk about Wade, we talk about some of the more traditional players they have, but we have seen that Eric likes space in these situations, and so I could see a lot of minutes for Olynyk and possibly even Ellington down the stretch. And Wayne can win you a game if he's having one of those nights where he's making 5 or 6 threes. And the other thing, guys, he's playing for a contract. So because we don't know what his future is going to be next season. So that plays into it, too. So I will put those 2 guys aside. I'll let Ira jump in with his.
My guy is, and it's almost as I was listening to the first 4, I got a little bit more clarity here. It's James Johnson. And the thing about James Johnson, and if you look at his statistics this year, there's been very little middle ground. He's either been really good or just god-awful, but very rarely has there been sort of something in between. If you look at his scoring this year, he has a 4-point game followed by a 20-point game, a 3-point game followed by a 23-point game, a 5-point game followed by an 18-point game. He's been all over the place. But the thing is, you only have to win 4 games in a series to advance. Can he put 4 of those together? Because of all the elements we have discussed what you need, rebounding, defense, 3-point shooting, offense to keep up with another team, James Johnson can do all of those things at times as well as anyone on this team. And so when I look at it, the other point I was trying to make during the Josh Richardson segment was this. Who is going to be the Heat's man of the hour defensively when all the switches are done and it's mano-a-mano? He's the only one who gives you a chance against LeBron James. He could be the only one who gives you a chance against Ben Simmons. He was even in Toronto, and I know this is overstated here, but sort of looked as their LeBron stopper. To me, Justice Winslow is not big enough. Josh Richardson is not big enough when you get more of a brawny, lengthy kind of guy. So I think James Johnson can have the full package. I could see the Heat winning a 7-game series with James Johnson being the star by having 3 20-point games and 3 3-point games. And you're going to have to ride the Johnson coaster, sort of like the beard comes, the beard goes, the hair comes, the hair goes. It's always looking different with James Johnson. But when James Johnson is the player that they felt was worth a 4-year, $60 million contract last summer, we know he has those moments in him. We saw it at 30-11 last season. I think the Heat have to hope somehow they can conjure 3 or 4 of those James Johnson moments because we know defensively he will be also the defensive man of the hour.
For me, the answer is Justice Winslow because it's something that I got into earlier, but it's the idea that you can't have a player on the floor that gets schemed out of the series. And while Justice Winslow over the course of the season had a 3-point percentage that was respectable, it was actually pretty good when you look at it on aggregate. I still don't think that there's going to be teams in the league that are going to trust the fact that Justice Winslow is actually a 39% 3-point shooter. Mm-hmm. So I just imagine a series where you have Winslow and Whiteside on the floor at the same time. There's going to be a lack of attention paid to Justice Winslow, and he's going to have to make the shot. He's going to have to account for the fact that teams aren't going to respect him, and we're going to have to see how the series ends up folding when he's in the game, because I think that Brett Brown or Tyronn Lue, they're familiar with these tactics, and they're going to dare Justice Winslow to make 3-pointers, and he's going to have to make them. And there are times where it looks pretty good, and there are times where it looks flatly terrible. So for me, if I'm sort of picking a secondary player beyond Dwyane Wade, I would say Winslow.
All right, thanks to Ira for joining us. Always, you can follow his work at Ira Heatbeat. That's on Twitter. He also has a Facebook page. Go to sunsentinel.com. You can't avoid Ira. He's everywhere. Will be everywhere during the playoffs. Also, you find him on NBA TV as well. If you want another way to find us, one thing I should have mentioned earlier in the podcast, download an app called Live Vote. You can find it on Google Play. Again, it's called live vote.
Also
Go
on
there.
iTunes, also on the Apple Store.
Oh, on iTunes. We don't want to forget that. We usually prioritize our Apple people, so I wanted to make sure I got everybody else involved there too. But yes, on iTunes or on Google Play, download live vote. What we're going to be doing there is posting a YouTube version of the podcast, and we're going to be posting questions directly related to the podcast. The reason you're going to want to get involved in this now is down the road, we're probably going to have some contests and other things to sort of reward our listeners for listening. So download the app now. It's free, and you'll be part of it in the future. And as always, follow us at 5, that's the number 5, 5 Reasons Sports, at 5 Reasons Sports. Later in the week, we're going to be talking to Howard Beck from Bleacher Report. He's a national NBA writer. We're going to be talking about 5 storylines for the upcoming NBA playoffs, focusing in particular on players who are most on the spot. Also look for a Heat Stories episode coming up here pretty soon. So a lot of basketball. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.